Greetings, respected viewers. I am George from Ireland. I'm here on Cambridge Street in London, the Pimlico area. Well, behind me is the house where Jomo Kenyatta lived. He was there briefly in 1930 and again 1934 to 37. So Jomo Kenyatta is best known for having been the first president of Kenya. So he was born in what was then British East Africa, probably in 1894. The year of his birth is uncertain. Very few people in Kenya had birth certificates in those days. Jomo Kenyatta was not his real name. Forgive me, I can't actually remember what his actual name was. So there was a Church of Scotland mission near there. And within the British Empire, the Scots, they gravitated towards particular regions, especially East Africa, that's so Kenya, what's now Tanzania, Malawi, and maybe Zambia, partly because Dr. Livingstone was in Zambia, and then the northwest frontier of India, as in that's now Pakistan. Anyway, so there he learnt English and he became literate because, of course, until the 1890s, very few people in Kenya couldn't read and write. Some people on the coast were speaking Swahili, learnt Arabic, and that was that. But people in the interior of the country, they had no form of writing. So he was converted to Christianity. And he worked for the Church of Scotland, indeed, for a while. And one of the missionaries arranged some medical treatment for him, which probably saved his life as a teenager. And he noticed that the racism amongst the missionaries might have been well-intentioned in some ways, but they certainly had anti-black prejudices. So, for example, after the service, he would have to sort of clean down the pews, and the two different races came in at different times to attend divine service. He did various jobs in Nairobi. He was a water meter reader. He was an interpreter at a court because obviously he spoke Kikuyu. That was his native language. So then he moved abroad after the First World War. He spent some time in Hamburg, Germany, in Moscow. He studied communism. He decided it was the wrong path. And that was quite unusual. A lot of African nationalists at the time thought that communism was the way forward, that the Soviet government was sympathetic to them. They'd held wars for sort of anti-imperialist congresses, despite obviously the Soviet government being extremely imperialistic itself, was utterly dishonest about the fact it was imperialist. But the British Empire was not questioned by very many people in Kenya. At the beginning, in 1930s, there wasn't that much political consciousness. So he married a few times. He married a white woman, for instance. I don't think his marriages were at the same time, was simultaneous, I should say. So he came here to London, and he spoke English with perfect correctitude. He used to wear his folk dress, go to Trafalgar Square, address people from standing on those lions and so on. He did various jobs. He found it difficult to make ends meet, and he was often behind his rent to his landlady there. He appeared as an extra in Sanders of the River, that 1930s film about a fictitious district commissioner in Nigeria, and Paul Robeson had a major part in that, singing, the famous African-American communist opera singer. So anyway, after the Second World War, right after the war, there's a congress here in Manchester, the United Kingdom, and Jomo Kenyatta, he met Kwame Nkrumah, Dr. Hastings Manda, and other apostles of African independence. So they campaigned for freedom of expression in the colonies. So oddly, they're brought back here. It wasn't really divide and rule, it was unite and rule, because they had what they wouldn't have had 50 years earlier, as in a common language and a transport system, which meant people from different portions of Africa met each other and developed a collective consciousness. So he returned to Kenya. Hello? I'm filming that house. Okay, so then he helped to form the Kikuyu Central Association. I'm standing in front of a house, and there's to shelter myself from the rain. This woman was rather suspicious of me. And to begin with, he's only concerned about the Kikuyu people, not Kenyans more generally, because the Kenyans divide into several tribes or linguistic groups, if you prefer, and they didn't always get on with each other. They'd sometimes fought against each other, and Kenya was just a British creation. There was no sense of Kenya till he came along, so he'd taken this name Jomo Kenyatta. I thought Jomo means burning spear. I might have got that wrong, and Kenyatta from some sort of bead belt that he wore. He wrote a book in 1938 entitled Facing Mount Kenya. Read it, and it's like an anthropological study of the Kikuyu people, about their mythology, their ceremonies around birth, marriage rituals and so on, the importance of cattle and so forth. And there's some photos of him in it. And Mount Kenya is, of course, a mountain in Kenya. I suppose it lends its name to the whole country. But he suggested at the end that if the British administration treated the indigenous people of the country better, then the Kikuyu would have something to gain from the British. But he didn't think the situation was delightful the way it was in the 1930s, when the British arrived in Kenya in the 1890s. They took a lot of the land, and they said, we're going to have sedentary agriculture. They discouraged this sort of nomadic lifestyle of many people, and they said to people, well, you can stay on this land, but you're going to have to do some unpaid days of labor per year, and blah, blah, blah. So, and the whites virtually monopolized power, their legislative council. So many Kenyans had volunteered for the British Army in the Second World War, come back more politically awake, and imbued with various political notions, and believed that there should be some sort of payback for their military service. And more whites moved to Kenya after the Second World War. So there are all these white immigrants there, and some of them had a very condescending attitudes towards the autochthonous people of the country. And then Mau Mau began its campaign about 1952, just after Elizabeth II became queen, led by Dedan Kimathi. Now, he wanted reform. Jomo Kenyatta wanted reform, but he had no truck with Mau Mau, which was only amongst one tribe. It wasn't amongst Kenyans generally, and it was partly a religious aspect to it. They underwent these oathing ceremonies, hiding out in the forest. They're fighting, and anyway, so the security forces took this very seriously. It was a successful counterinsurgency campaign. They interned hundreds of thousands of Kikuyu men. And the Kikuyu population fell partly because the men were separated from the women in many cases for some time. I think even Obama's grandfather was amongst those who was rounded up, arrested, just held for a while without charge or trial. And some suspected Mau Mau fighters were very severely beaten up. Several of them died in Camp Hola, and there was one who was even castrated, so some of the most appalling things were done. Anyway, a lot of the Mau Mau fighters were killed. Some loyal Kenyans were killed as well. Very few whites were killed in that. The expression "make it through the soup" comes from there, as a Mau Mau liked to attack the white immigrants in their houses at dinner time. So that was defeated by about 1956, but he was sent to prison, having been convicted of sedition in relation to Mau Mau. He denied all charges. It's widely believed he was actually not guilty of this, and some of these white immigrants said that he ought to be hanged. Anyway, so he was released after 8.5 years, and then he had his own political party, the Kenyan African National Union. African meaning as in for black people. About 2% of the population is white. There are a few Indians, a few Arabs as well. So there'd been a complete change of policy after Suez. It was agreed, all right, Kenya must go towards independence. So that was that. He won the election. The Queen came out for the hauling down the flag ceremony, and the moment before it was due to be lowered, Prince Philip said to him, "Are you sure you don't want to change your mind?" That's the Queen's husband with his wicked wit. I'm not sure if Jomo Kenyatta appreciated that witticism. Anyway, so that was that. He was president of the Republic of Kenya. He was rather old by this time. He had a son, Uhuru, meaning freedom, who was born not long before, who is president of Kenya currently. So that was that. It was one of the most stable countries in Africa. It developed quite well. Literacy improved, and the economy is doing quite well. It's obviously thrived through tourism, and there are things like tea plantations because it's got lots of high mountains near the Rift Valley, so suitable for the cultivation of such crops. And Nairobi, it just became an enormous city. And you go back to 1900, it didn't exist. It was then a railway station was built there, and it grew very rapidly indeed. A lot of the Indian community, or Asian community, perhaps I should say more accurately, they left in the 60s, were not satisfied with the way things were going. And some of the black Kenyans didn't like them. Some of them moved back. So there we are. So, he had his flaws. It wasn't entirely democratic towards the end. Western governments liked him because he definitely wasn't a communist. But he was obviously slightly losing his marbles towards the end of his time. And then Daniel Arap Moi was brought in to be the vice president, and he succeeded him and took over and ruled the country somewhat with an iron hand for the next 27 years, if I got that right. So that's Jomo Kenyatta. He died in 1978, and they immediately started playing funerary tunes on the radio, I think not even having announced his death. So, like him or not, he was a titan of Africa in the 20th century. That is Jomo Kenyatta.